Welcome everybody to TBA's virtual convention and our program celebrating the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage and the 19th Amendment with special guests Elaine Weiss and Bill Haltom. My name is Sherry Edwards. I am Vice President of Corporate and Legal for State Volunteer Mutual Insurance Company in Brentwood, Tennessee, and I am also for the next 2 hours Vice President of the Tennessee Bar Association. I'll be your moderator for today's event. A few notes before we get started. If you have a question for our panelists, if you'll look at the bottom of your screen, there is a little Q&A box. Myself or our TBA staff will be monitoring this block. Click Q&A at the bottom. The chat is also available, and with time permitting, our panelists will answer your questions live. I'd like to introduce now our speakers, Elaine Weiss, who will be interviewed today by Bill Haltom. Let me tell you a little bit about them. Bill Haltom, who has been a friend of mine for several years and is one of my favorite people in the world, is the author of 6 books and has been a newspaper and magazine columnist for over 25 years. He has served as chair of the editorial boards for 4 magazines, including the ABA Journal, the flagship publication of the American Bar Association. Bill is also the past president of the Tennessee Bar Association, but he's better known by Tennessee lawyers as a columnist for the TBA Journal and an author. He's written 8 books, including his latest, Why Can't Mother Vote? Joseph Hanover and the Unfinished Business of Democracy. Elaine Weiss, who I hope is a new friend, is a Baltimore-based journalist and author whose feature writing has been recognized with prizes from the Society of Professional Journalists, and her byline has appeared in many national publications, as well as in reports for National Public Radio. Her long-form writing garnered a Pushcart Prize Editor's Choice Award, and she is a proud McDowell Colony Fellow. Elaine's most recent book, The Woman's Hour, The Great Fight to Win the Vote, and I hope you can see it, has won critical acclaim from the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Christian Science Monitor, and the New Yorker magazine, hailed as a riveting, nail-biting political thriller with powerful parallels to today's political environment. The Woman's Hour was a Goodreads Reader's Choice Award winner, shortlisted for the 2019 Chautauqua Prize, and received the ABA's highest honor, the 2019 Silver Gavel Award. I am pleased to introduce Bill Haltom and Elaine Weiss. Sit back and enjoy this next hour, and be sure, again, to use either the Q&A or chat boxes to ask your questions.
Well, thank you, Sherry. Good morning, Elaine.
Good morning, Bill.
I'm going to call you Elaine because I'm honored to know you. You have so many friends in Tennessee. We regard you as a Tennessee sister suffragist, and we just thank you, first of all, for writing this wonderful book, the quintessential book on women's suffrage and the history. And thank you so much for joining us because this is the Tennessee story. And in your presentation today, you talked so much about Tennessee lawyers and Tennessee activists, and so we just thank you so much for as we approach the 100th anniversary. Tennessee story. I want to start off with this. This is a Tennessee story. The volunteer state was in fact the perfect 36th, the state that ratified it coming up 100 years, August 18th, 1920. And from your research about our story in Tennessee, 7 southern states had rejected it. What do you think it was the unique aspects of Tennessee that made it not just in terms of timing, but a place that ultimately did ratify that amendment?
Thank you, Bill. It's just great to be with you. I wish I was with everyone in person, but I'd love to give you a sense of Tennessee in 1920. It was a it's always an interesting place, as we know, but it was an especially interesting situation in summer of 1920. The nation had just come out of war. You had some wonderful heroes from Tennessee in the Great War, as we know, including Sergeant Alvin York. But the economy was in bad shape. The railroads had been nationalized, and they were coming out of nationalization, and they needed help. There was racial strife. around the country, including in Tennessee. There were quite a few disturbances around the state. There was labor strife. There was anxiety about immigration. And Tennessee and Nashville, where, of course, the capital, this was all taking place, saw itself as in the vanguard of the New South. This was a progressive state, and it had progressive views, and it wanted to prove that in some way by ratifying the 19th Amendment. So you see a real struggle going on in the minds of Tennesseans, and especially elected officials, about what was Tennessee's role going to be. And the suffragists understand this and take advantage of it and appeal to the legislators and to the governor and to the civic elite of the city and the state, saying, Tennessee is the queen of the southern states. Where Tennessee goes, the South goes, and you need to stand up and take that role in this new era. Now, what's also interesting is in 1919, Tennessee actually granted partial suffrage to its women citizens. Partial suffrage was this very interesting middle ground where I think the way to put it was giving women half a loaf, saying you could vote, but only in certain elections, only for presidential electors, which is basically when you're voting for president, in some cases for municipal suffrage, meaning you could vote for your mayor or for your city councilman, but you cannot vote for your state representative, your governor, your congressman, your senator, those places that really held power. So the Tennessee legislature in 1919 actually did pass this partial suffrage, I think mostly in hopes of staving off having to deal with the federal amendment, saying Tennessee women have a little bit of the vote, so you should be happy. So there's very interesting tensions going on in Tennessee, but Tennessee does provide what looks like the last best hope for the suffragists to get full ratification, get that 36th state, 3/4 of the 48 states in the Union as provided in the Constitution, get that last state to ratify before the fall election, because the election of 1920 is going to be pivotal. The nation is deciding what direction to take in this 20th century. It's deciding what kind of leadership in the world it wants to assume. It's making some very important decisions, and women want to be part of it. And there are forces who do not want women to be part of it. So this all comes down, this whole fight with international implications comes down to Tennessee.
Elaine, you mentioned Tennessee had passed partial suffrage in 1919, and from reading your book, I understand that passed pretty quickly and with support from people who later turned the next year and opposed it. Tell us a little bit about that and how we went in 1 year from people like the Speaker of the House, Seth Walker, speaking passionately for partial suffrage, and the next year leading the opposition.
Yes, it's a fascinating turnaround. And I think there are a few things that can explain it. One was there really was support for suffrage in the legislature. And I think one of the heartening parts of my research in what happened in Tennessee was so many men and so many legislators truly believed in women's equality, that women deserved the vote, that this was a matter of justice, and they stand up. Seth Walker is an interesting character. He's against suffrage from most of his career in the legislature. He's against it when the partial suffrage measure comes before the House. And he does this flip-flop sort of in the middle of the session. And no one quite understands why he does this. And I was never able to truly find out why he supports partial suffrage. We have some inkling of why in the next session in 1920, when they are considering ratification, he turns again. He really betrays the suffragists. He says he will support it, and then he turns around. There's the matter of states' rights also, which enters into this story very powerfully. The South, the southern states, are still very conscious of the Reconstruction Amendments, the 14th and 15th Amendments, the 13th Amendment too, and they are very wary of Washington telling the states who should be able to go into the ballot box. Now we'll see the same argument reverberate in the middle of the century, in the civil rights era. We see it today. But in 1919, there's a sense, well, if Tennessee wants to give its women the vote, that's fine, but we don't want Washington to tell us by a federal amendment that we must give women the vote. And there you get the racial aspect comes in. Basically, Tennessee wants to have the vote for white women. And if it administers its own state law, it will be able to do that more easily than if Washington has mandated it with a federal amendment. Now, what we know will happen is the southern states will succeed in undermining the 19th Amendment. But at the time in 1919 and in 1920, the states' rights issue is very much on everyone's mind.
Elaine, you mentioned the racial context of the times. And of course, this is in the Jim Crow era. Clearly, as you wonderfully explain in the book, there is a racial undertone to this whole debate. Although in parts of the state, most notably Memphis, African-American voters were voting. Boss Crump in Memphis was actually, as I understand, paying their poll taxes at the time. So tell us a little bit about that racial background and that racial context that was underlying the whole debate in the summer of 1920.
Well, race is part of this story from the very beginning of the women's suffrage movement, which grows out of and in tandem with the abolition movement. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Stanton and Lucy Stone and Lucretia Mott, the women we look to as the foremothers of the women's rights and women's suffrage movement, begin their political careers as abolitionists. And so suffrage retains in some parties that image of being very much aligned with the abolition movement. And in fact, the 19th Amendment is popularly called the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. And suffragists call it that in honor of her. And anti-suffragists, especially in the South, call it Susan B. Anthony to remind everyone that she was an abolitionist and you should have nothing to do with suffrage. So it's used, it's sort of used both ways. The racial aspect of the suffrage fight is something that really needs to be explored and reckoned with, because it takes several dimensions. Of course, in the South, it's mostly concerned with African-American voting. Black men were given the vote in 1870 in the 15th Amendment, which we know was hotly debated in the State House in Nashville. I believe there is, in the railings of the staircase, there are still traces of the bullet holes that were fired in the heated debate. There's some differing historical accounts of how those bullet holes got there, but we know it was a very, very emotional, passionate, and divisive debate over the 15th Amendment. In the end, it didn't matter that much, because in many cases, and again, there's local jurisdictions for this, like in Memphis, Black men were intimidated. They were stopped at the polls by poll taxes, by really ridiculous literacy tests, by the threat of losing their jobs. there's lots and lots of reasons why Black men are not allowed to vote. They have the right to vote, but they're not allowed. And when it comes to women's suffrage, the southern states, and Tennessee has this debate too, well, do we want to have to go through all this with Black women too? And that becomes one of the driving arguments of the anti-suffrage forces. And there's great fear that there's also, one of the things we don't often talk about is Congress has the power to enforce this amendment, as it did the 15th Amendment. It will choose not to in both cases until the Civil Rights Law in 1865. But going back to the 14th Amendment, there is Section 2 of the 14th Amendment says that any state that restricts or denies the vote to a segment of its population can lose representation in Congress. It's never used. It has never been implemented. But in the fight in 1920 in Tennessee, we see broadsides and advertisements by the anti-suffragists saying these force bills in Congress, basically forcing, do you want to open up the horrors of Reconstruction? Do you want Washington to be asking why we're not implementing the 15th Amendment? And do you realize that the southern states could lose this much, and if they actually have a chart, Mississippi will lose so many congressmen, Tennessee would lose so many congressmen if Congress really enforced this. So one of the arguments becomes, let's not even go there, because Washington might notice that we are violating the 15th Amendment as well. And now, if we do not allow Black women to vote, we'll be violating another constitutional amendment, and it might be more trouble for us. So there's very interesting legal arguments, or let's call them extra legal arguments, being made by the anti-suffragists saying, we don't want to have Washington telling us to do this. And they, according to the 19th Amendment, Black women, all women, are granted the vote. And this becomes a problem.
You mentioned this context of race, and I want to ask you, this is kind of a delicate situation that you did address in your wonderful book, which is how that issue was actually addressed by Carrie Chapman Catt and the suffragist leaders. You mentioned in your lecture earlier, your speech, that Frederick Douglass was at Seneca Falls. So much of the movement was about abolition of slavery. And yet in the summer of 1920, Carrie Chapman Catt, I think, issued a statement, did she not, trying to indicate, well, this isn't really, I think the line was, white supremacy is not threatened by this. Comment on that.
Yes, this is a part of the suffrage legacy, which should and does make us uncomfortable. The suffragists knew that they had, in order to get the amendment through Congress, remember, the amendment, a federal amendment to guarantee women the right to vote, was introduced into Congress in 1878, and it stood there. It was stalled there purposefully for 40 years. 40 years. Does not emerge until 1919, summer of 1919. So they realize that they have to convince men in the Congress. Of course, by 1917, there's one woman in the Congress, Jeanette Rankin. But they have to convince, overwhelmingly, men, and some of them racist men, to accept this idea that all women can vote. They decide to do this, and I see this as a cowardly argument, but a politically prudent one. They do this by trying to play down what this will mean in the southern states. And they use all kinds of arguments, and this has been going on for years. One of them is, there are more white women than Black women in the southern states, so white women will vote and nothing will change. And in that sense, they are correct. and just the math is there. But they use that, and again, it's a very should make us very squeamish. They're saying white supremacy is safe even if women vote, because white women will vote to maintain the status quo. The Carrie Cat at one point, and again, we have to also understand that then they have to go back in the ratification process. They have to go back to all those southern states and convince the legislatures, the men of the legislature, to ratify. So they have to go back and try to assuage their fears about, sometimes it's called Negro domination. I mean, just anti-suffragists blow it way out of proportion. Simple justice becomes Negro domination. And the suffragists say, no. It's not going to be so catastrophic. Don't worry about that. They attack, again, the suffragists get it from both sides. They're using racist arguments, but they're also being attacked by the anti-suffragists for being too friendly to African Americans. The anti-suffragists, as I describe in the book, have what they call a museum in the hotel, the Hermitage Hotel, and it shows, purports to show things that would that the legislators should look at and be concerned. And so one of them is pictures of Susan B. Anthony and quote unquote her Negro friends, which she had many. So it shows photographs of them and said, do you want this? Because there is the fear that if Black women are given political equality, they may assume they have social equality. And this is a threat to the foundations of white supremacy. So the suffragists in Nashville and all through this period are being attacked by the anti-suffragists, and Carrie Cat is accused on this floor of the Tennessee House. She's accused of advocating for interracial marriage. And it's interesting. You kind of want to say, well, good for her. But in fact, she realizes how explosive this would be. If that accusation stuck, that could influence certain legislators. And so she does something which I find a moral compromise that's very unfortunate, and we should recognize that it is a very poor choice. And she says, oh no, I never said that, or I didn't mean it. I mean, she really kind of runs away from what could have been a strong moral stance. And at this point, they are scared. Their support has eroded. She really fears the amendment will be defeated in Tennessee. And the charitable way of saying this was she was kind of scared out of her wits and was willing to do anything to save the amendment. There are less charitable ways to interpret it. So we see race, we see race in the anti-suffrage communications, their broadsides, their cartoons, their manifestos. And we see the suffragists having to kind of thread the needle here, not arouse the racist fears in the state while still trying to make sure this amendment goes through. The Tennessee suffragists, for the most part, I think truly are supportive of all women voting. Not all, certainly not all. And what will happen afterwards is, the next part of the story.
I want to go into that area, but I think we have, Sherry, I think we have at least a couple of questions, maybe more than that, but would you share a couple of questions for Elaine?
I'd be happy to. Okay, the first question, Elaine, in your book, you talk a lot on the role and power of newspapers in affecting attitudes on the issue. Could you expand more on that during this discussion?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, I was especially interested in how the press covered. Remember, the newspapers are pretty much newspapers and magazines are the only mass media we have at the time. There's no radio in use. That will actually come into use later in the year in the presidential election for the very first time. But most people do not have radio sets. Radio is not a communications tool at that time. So we have newspapers. And what I found is that in almost every city in America, there was at least one suffrage supporting newspaper, meaning their editorial board supported it when it came to that state, either through a referendum, a campaign that was being fought, or at the federal level when the amendment is being going around the country being ratified. There was usually a suffrage and an anti-suffrage newspaper, and sometimes there were two of each. We had many more newspapers at that time. It's one of the sad things to realize how many newspapers we have lost. There were dozens and dozens and scores in Tennessee. Every small town had one. So we've lost a lot over the century, and we're losing them still. That's another call to arms about local journalism. But what was interesting is Tennessee has an especially vivid example, one of them being that the Chattanooga Times is owned by the Oaks family. They also own another newspaper called the New York Times. And both of those newspapers are solidly anti-suffragist throughout the whole campaign. And so you see the influence. Chattanooga Times was a pretty powerful newspaper in the state. And you see their anti-suffrage attitudes in their editorial pages. Now, their reporting was actually pretty straight and very detailed. And I used it a lot because it was very good. But you see, and then there's the Chattanooga News, which is a pro-suffrage newspaper. So they cover things a little differently. And of course, the editorial pages are totally different. Same thing happens in Nashville, where you have the Nashville Tennessean, very pro-suffrage, and the Nashville Banner, very anti-suffrage. And again, these are where Americans are getting their information. There's not a whole spectrum. They can't go to different radio stations or television or, goodness knows, mass social media or the internet. So newspapers have a powerful effect in getting news and molding opinion. And you see the suffrage battle on the pages of the letters to the editor. You see this all the time, and fascinating glimpses into what people really cared about. And so you have clergymen writing in on both sides of the issue. Some clergymen saying this is an abomination and Adam supposed to dominate Eve and this is against all biblical teaching. And then you have other clerics saying, oh no, women bring special gifts to the public arena, and we should support that. And then you see people who are, again, the racial dynamic plays out in these pages. So I think that newspapers had even more of an influence on public opinion than they do now.
Jerry, next question.
Next question. Ms. Weiss, thank you for your work on this important piece of history. I'm from Northeast Tennessee. I wanted to know if in your research you were able to learn anything about the suffrage movement in this area or more broadly in rural Tennessee.
Yes, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to pinpoint. I probably have it in my notes somewhere. But one of the things to realize is Tennessee was a very active suffrage state. It had been organizing since the late 19th century. Now, the South was not an easy place to organize. Suffrage was not popular. It was not considered proper for dignified women to enter into this movement, certainly not to march in the streets, which they did. in Nashville, in Memphis, in Chattanooga. So you had to have a certain courage and conviction to join it. But women did, and they did in rural Tennessee too. The Grange was one of the first important supporters of suffrage, because women were always uh, given rights and responsibilities in the Grange movement. So you see some interesting allies form in rural Tennessee. Now, that's not to say it's not a conservative place, and conservative social mores are very strong and influential on the population. So I would say it probably penetrates a little less than it does in a city like Nashville, but you certainly see rural women and men supporting it. Remember, this whole drama in Tennessee will come down to a mother and son in rural Nyota in East Tennessee, you know, a little hilltop town, and certainly there are supporters there. So I think it's very fair to say that in parts of rural Tennessee, suffrage was a popular subject.
Thank you.
Thank
That's
you,
all the
Sherry.
questions we have right now.
Thank you, Sherry. Elaine, you just mentioned something I want to inquire about. You said in the newspapers there were editorial letters to the editor or columns by clergy on both sides.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to talk to you about, you know, Tennessee has always been a fairly religious state, a faith-based state. This 1920, we're 5 years away from the Scopes trial. Okay?
Yes, indeed.
And tell us a little bit about the battle of women of faith, maybe starting with Josephine Pearson from Monteagle, Tennessee, who was leading the opposition, and why she led the opposition to the passage.
Yes. Josephine Pearson, one of my main characters in the book, fascinating woman, the daughter of a minister, Methodist minister, and she grows up in Monteagle on the assembly grounds there. And she is the most well-educated woman I follow in the book. She has graduate degrees. She is a political scientist. She's a dean at small Christian women's colleges. So she's very well educated. She's very articulate, and she is very much against women's suffrage. And part of that comes from her heritage, from her mother and father, very conservative people. And her mother especially is a very strong temperance advocate. And it's very interesting because you think, well, that would lead her to perhaps embrace suffrage, because the suffragists, for the most part, not completely, were also very strongly identified with the temperance movement. And, you know, we think about, well, why is suffrage and temperance associated? And of course, that becomes a big issue in Tennessee with its strong influence of liquor industry. For some women, you know, the WCTU, Women's Christian Temperance Union, for some it's a moral issue. It's a moral issue of drinking being sinful. But for many other women, it's actually a domestic violence issue, because women had very little legal recourse if their husband or their father or their brother were abusing liquor and abusing them. They could not bring a civil suit in court. They were not allowed to do that. They couldn't testify on their own behalf. If they divorced or tried to divorce, it was very difficult. They would lose custody of their children. They had no custodial rights. So for many reasons, women are powerless in the face of abuse that's fueled by liquor. And so they say, well, let's go to the source. Let's try to make liquor itself illegal. And so that's part of the drive, not the full reasoning. But Josephine's mother is against both liquor and the idea of women voting, because for her, it is biblical again, relationship of Adam and Eve, and God's plan for women is to be the moral center of the home and should not venture into the public sphere. And Josephine absorbs this and even amplifies it. And there's a scene in the book, which comes from Josephine's memoir, saying that on her mother's deathbed, she asks Josephine to defend her home state, Tennessee, against the evils of suffrage if it ever comes to the state. And Josephine promises her mother on her deathbed that she will do this. And that's part of her rationale of becoming president of the Tennessee Association of Women opposed to women's suffrage, and then leading the Tennessee anti-suffragists in Nashville in the ratification fight. As we will see this fascinating division of clerics, not just in Tennessee, but across the nation. Those of the more, what we call, liberal denominations tend to favor women's suffrage. The Quakers are one of the first to be involved in the movement because Quaker women in certain, denominations of Quakerism are allowed to speak and to be leaders in the congregations. We'll see this in every religion. In the Catholic religion, there are cardinals who give some qualified support. There are others who rail against it from the pulpit and in all the publications. See it in Judaism. Some rabbis are supportive and some do not. We see that even in Tennessee. I remember seeing lists of anti-suffrage women, and one rabbi's wife is part of the anti-suffrage, and one rabbi's wife is part of the suffrage movement. And in the Baptists, again, it tended to be how conservative they were in other things, how they stood. But it does become, you see a lot of God language in the debates in the Tennessee legislature. And you see a lot of, this is not what God wants, and I'm interpreting it as, your delegate. We see that in Congress and in legislatures today. But the religion is injected into this as a reason to either support it or to oppose it.
I have to ask you, you mentioned the Jack Daniel's suite at the Hermitage Hotel. And can you comment on the kind of I hate to use this phrase, but I'm just going to say it, the unholy alliance between the Women's Christian Temperance Union and Josephine Pearson and the liquor industry.
Right. Well, as your members probably know, as members of the bar, Tennessee had been a dry state since, I believe it's 1909. So it had technically been dry for a long time. And in fact, the Jack Daniel's distillery had moved. It was no longer, for that period, it was actually not in Tennessee. There was one brewery, I think in I'm going to get this one, I think Alabama, and another one further north. So, but that didn't mean that liquor wasn't being enjoyed in Tennessee during that 10 years before national prohibition comes in. Especially, you mentioned Memphis, Edward Crump, Boss Crump, very powerful Democratic leader there for many, many decades. And he didn't think prohibition was good for his city or his region, because tourism was a big thing in Memphis, and the music halls and drinking was all part of that. And he said, no, this is not good for us. And so the liquor laws were not enforced. The Tennessee state liquor laws were not enforced in Memphis. And he actually got thrown out of the his mayoral post because of that. At one point, he became sort of the boss of the county. So in 1920, you see a very interesting alliance. The liquor industry had been fighting against suffrage on the national level for a long time because of women's suffragists' alliance with temperance. Now in summer of 1920, prohibition's in effect. It is already in effect. The Volstead Acts have been enacted first of the year. And you say, wow, that train's left the station. Why are the liquor industry still involved in this? What they're hoping is that if they can keep women away from the ballot box in 1920, so consider in Tennessee, by the partial suffrage law of 1919, Tennessee women can vote for president and for municipal offices, but they can't vote for their legislature. They can't vote for their congressional representatives. So they're hoping if they can keep it that way, then they can make sure that there are enough, as they call it, wet candidates, those who do not support prohibition, that the laws won't be enacted very stringently. It'll be a wink and a nod, which it was in Tennessee for a decade, and that this will keep going if they can just make sure women don't upset the apple cart and try to get more dry candidates in there. So that's what's happening. And the anti-suffrage women, even though they're temperance supporters, are willing to take the money and the influence, and they set up this incredible speakeasy on the 8th floor of the Hermitage Hotel, where liquor is dispensed morning, noon, and night to the legislators with a lesson on why they should kill ratification. And so there's these scenes of legislators just bouncing off the walls and singing, "Keep the home fires burning," and they have to be thrown into a shower before they can sober up and be brought to the chamber. And at one point, Carrie Catt is just horrified and says, "Is this entire legislature drunk?" And the Tennessee suffragists just say, "Oh yes, that's the way it is." So it's a very interesting, it becomes almost comical, but the money was not comical. And clearly the liquor industry is seeing this as their last possible defense against ratification. And so they're pumping money into the anti-suffrage bribery, publications, things like that. So that's that unholy alliance. And whether it made the women like Josephine Pearson uncomfortable, we get a little hints of that, but they were willing to go along.
Elaine, you mentioned that the Jack Daniel's suite was on the 8th floor of the Hermitage, I believe. Which, let's talk about the Hermitage. The context of place, the third house of the legislature, I think was referred to it in those days. Tell us about that place and the battle of the War of the Roses in the lobby of the Hermitage Hotel.
Right. The Hermitage, one of the wonderful things that I was able to find, my first research trip to Nashville. Of course, I spent most of my time in the Tennessee State Library and Archives, which is just a block or two from the Hermitage, next to the Capitol. Actually, that is, I think, moving soon, but it was there when I started. And the Hermitage, I was able to visit a lot of the places I write about, and to the credit of Tennessee and Nashville, a lot of them look as they did, or at least you can see what it must have looked like. And the Hermitage was one of the first places, of course, I went to and was struck by the beauty. I'd read the descriptions of how beautiful a place. It had been built just 10 years before, 1900. It was the project of a group of businessmen who said, Nashville needs a 5-star hotel. It needs a really, really great hotel. And so they build one. It has all the latest amenities, and it's only 2 blocks or even less from the Capitol. So it's the place where legislators stay in the last 10 years when they're in its existence. And it becomes the focal point of this, as you say, War of the Roses, because the suffragists and suffrage supporters wear yellow rose in their lapel. and the anti-suffragists wear red roses. So you can tell where everybody stands just by looking at them. There are these great scenes of women standing at Union Station and pouncing on the legislators as they arrive for the session and trying to pin, each one trying to pin their colors to them. There's one senator, Lon McFarlane, who refuses to reveal how he stands, and he finds a bi-colored rose and wears that every. So the hotel becomes the headquarters for both groups of suffragists. There are two different rival suffrage groups making their headquarters there. The anti-suffragists have their headquarters on the mezzanine level. The suffrage leaders are staying there. Carrie Catt, Sue White, the Tennessee suffragists are there too. The Tennessee anti-suffragists are staying there. So, and then the legislators, the corporate lobbyists who are there in force, the representatives of the presidential candidates who play a role in this. It's 1920, it's a presidential election. They've sent their minions in. Everybody is staying. They're staying in all the other hotels too. I don't want to make it sound like it was only the Hermitage, but the Hermitage, because of its proximity, because it's considered, the best in the city, becomes the place where everyone gathers in the beautiful lobby with the stained glass ceiling. And there are fistfights there, there are arguments there, there's gossip, there's deals being made. There are spies walking around the hotel in the corridors. The suffragists see them, listening through the transom, and the suffragists have to decide whether it's really hot. It's a hot spell in the summer. They have to decide whether they're going to close the transoms and really feel the heat even more, because it's only fans, there's no air conditioning yet, and or whether it's worth it to have to sweat while they're making their strategy decisions, or have them overheard through the transom. And there are telegraphs that are, there are telegrams that are stolen on the way to the hotel telegraph office. There's all kinds of shenanigans going on. There are death threats. There are, shall we put it, propositions for compromising situations being offered to the legislators. And all of this, is in this kind of magnificent space, that, as I said, third house of the legislature, because so much of the negotiations, the meetings, the strategies is happening in that hotel. And one of the very gratifying things is that Hermitage Hotel today, and for the past several years, has really embraced this legacy. They've now created a museum in the lobby of the hotel. They are offering suffrage tours and suffrage menus and even suffrage cocktails. And they've really taken this on as their own. And it's really thrilling to see them bring this history into their beautiful
Elaine, I might just mention that Tom and Wanda Vikstrom of the Hermitage. Tom's the historian of the Hermitage, and he and his spouse Wanda have really done a great job. And hopefully, as this pandemic hopefully begins to resolve, we hope more and more people should go there and see what they have done. It's incredible.
Absolutely. And I also, Tom was one of the first people I talked to. He took me on a tour, my first trip. We've been communicating for years, and it was my pleasure to help unveil this little museum last fall. And one of the really, I want to give a salute to Dee Patel, who's the general manager there, who's done such a fabulous job of bringing this history as part of the hotel and its role in creating a welcoming atmosphere for this incredibly important historical event that takes place there.
Sherry has another question, I believe.
Great.
Sherry?
I do. Yes, I do. Actually, I have two. This is from Margaret Bem. Hi, Margaret. Elaine, how did you, as a journalist and author from Baltimore, but not from Tennessee, decide to write The Woman's Hour, and how long did it take you to write it?
Well, hello to Margaret. I came across the story of Tennessee. I had never heard of it. I was doing some research on a slightly related, but not exactly on point subject. I was looking at parts of the suffrage movement. I was interested in it, realized I didn't know what had happened. I didn't know how the movement had developed. And I decided, as a politically aware American woman, I really needed to know this. And I have found that most people did not know this. And so I was reading a report in the Library of Congress. It was a report of how a bequest to the suffrage movement had been spent. It was $2 million. It was a huge bequest at the time. And it described how the money had been dispersed. And part of the use of the money was in the ratification campaigns in the state. Part of it went to start the League of Women Voters. And in the description, this 100-page report, I remember, like, on page 93 or 4, there's a description of the last suffrage ratification, the last ratification battle for the 19th Amendment in Tennessee. And it talks about the heat of the battle, how complex it was, how fraught it was. And then it tells the story of Harry Byrne and his change of vote. And I remember reading this. It was late one night at my desk. Everyone in my house is asleep. And I just remember going, oh, that's a story. And I decided I needed to explore this and, see whether this could really make a book. This could anchor the story of suffrage. And I found the wonderful book by Yellen and Sherman called The Perfect 36, which was a companion to a museum exhibit in 1994, I believe. And it was about Tennessee's role in, I think it was 1998, Tennessee's role in suffrage. And that became a roadmap for me. From the time I started research until the time I handed in the draft, the full manuscript, was 3.5 years. And so that I worked very intently, very monomaniacally, and I did turn that manuscript in the day before the 2016 election. And then there's another 6 or 7 months of editing with my wonderful editor at Viking Books in New York. And then, there's all the production and things. So from start to finish, it's really almost 5 years from the time I began research to the time the book is published. And that's not unusual. And then, of course, I've been on the road since, and that's been wonderful.
You have another question, Sherry?
We do have another question.
Great.
Well, we did have another question. Let me see. I assume the lobbying efforts by both the pro-suffrage and anti-suffrage advocates were expensive. Any insight on who was funding each side's efforts?
Yes, a bit. They didn't keep careful records. But what you can see, and again, there are different groups who are active. For the suffragists, we know there's 2 groups. There's Carrie Katz's National American Women's Suffrage Association and the Tennessee Suffragists. So some of that money comes from this bequest that I described, and some of that comes from the National Association. The Tennessee Association also has to really fund, has to bear a great deal of the monetary responsibilities, and they go into debt, and that actually becomes a problem for the next several years. They try to tap some wealthy suffrage women. They make appeals, we are the last state, help us, and they raise money locally. It was always a very hand-to-mouth kind of movement. They were never very well funded, but they really had to come to the fore. The Women's Party, National Women's Party, also working in Tennessee, led in Nashville by a young woman, a Tennessean from West Tennessee named Sue Shelton White. She and the Women's Party is always trying to fundraise, and they are getting dollars from teachers in Wyoming, and pennies from school children, and a $5 bill from a soldier in honor of his mother. And you see this, actually, Library of Congress has all of these, and I went through those. And so the money is very much catch or catch can. It's all volunteer labor, of course, and they pay for their own transportation going from, as they canvass all through the state in preparation for the legislature convening. The anti-suffragists, it's harder to track, but we know they are getting some corporate money, and there are some very wealthy women at the national level who are funding some of their activities too.
Thank you. I do have one other question. Oh, I'm sorry, Bill, did you?
No. Go ahead, Sherry. I didn't know you had another question. I apologize.
It came in on chat. Is the ethnic composition of majority white population, did that have anything to do with the eventual approval of suffrage in the state?
Yes, I think it did, because I think in the minds of many of the legislators, they saw women's suffrage as giving the vote to their women, who were white women, and their constituents, mostly who were white. So even in the most supportive statements on the House and Senate floor, you can see an element of this will give white women of Tennessee the vote. And there's one particularly disturbing debate going on where Seth Walker says Tennessee has to remain a white man's state. He says it right out loud, and he has support for that. And even those supporters of suffrage trying to defend their position of wanting ratification say, oh, don't worry, we're not going to have lots of Negroes voting. We'll make sure of that. So there is that element, even as we celebrate the ratification and the courage of some very, very dedicated men and women. There is always, often, I shouldn't say always, but often a racial element to whom they want the vote to go to.
Elaine, Sherry, unfortunately, our hour has come to an end. There's so many areas I wanted to talk to you about. I just recommend everyone get a copy of The Woman's Hour. You also mentioned The Perfect 36. Carol Yellen and Jan Ann Sherman. I also do a shout out for your dear friend Paula Casey.
Absolutely.
Who was one of the, I guess, the producers of the book, The Perfect 36, and is working with women, with Margaret Bim and women across the state of Tennessee as we promote that women's equality suffrage trail across the state of Tennessee. This has been absolutely wonderful to be with you, Elaine, and we look forward to seeing you in person, side by side, in future times in Tennessee.
Well, I hope to be there, and I just want to mention that just last week, the Young Readers edition of the book has been published. So for young readers, age 10 and up, this is a sort of streamlined version of the story, the inspiring story of what happened in Tennessee. So I hope in this time of activism that your young activists might be interested.
Well, that's good to know. I'll go and buy that for my grandson so he can read it in between his Harry Potter and
Absolutely.
his Percy Shelley. Yes.
Absolutely.
Thank you all so much. Appreciate both of you being here. Thanks to everybody who participated in this webinar. Please be sure to come to the Lawyers Luncheon at noon, where Michelle Sellers will be sworn in as our 140th TBA president, and we will see you all soon. Have a great day and take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.